Hi, everyone. This PowerPoint deals with the theme of civil rights in the 1950s, although I don't really talk about the incident that you see in the title slide with what happened at Central High School in Little Rock in 1957 with one of the Little Rock Nine black students, Elizabeth Eckford, being surrounded and threatened by this hostile white mob of both students and citizens. And in this, I'm going to focus on the murder of Emmett Till, but put that in a little bit of context in terms of what's happening in the post-war period, and also briefly mention the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954. So I mentioned to the class when we went through this PowerPoint during one of our Zoom sessions that one of the bizarre things about post-war America is you had this new medium, television, that presented an almost entirely white world. Two types of TV shows were extremely popular in the late 40s and into the 50s. Three, really. There were game shows that were primetime shows that were very popular. There were Westerns that were extremely popular, and then what we would now know as the family sitcom, family situation comedy that centered around white families, in most cases living in suburbia. And you've got several examples here. Got the cursor hovering over in the upper left, the show Father Knows Best. Over here to the right, the Donna Reed show. She's not well remembered so much now, except among old movie fans. She was in some movies with Jimmy Stewart, but she was a well-known actress of this period. In the middle is a TV show that's really like the grandfather of every reality TV show that's ever existed, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Not because it was reality TV, but I say that because the stars of this were a real family off camera, the Nelson family. Through the show, they were projected and presented as kind of the perfect white suburban family, happy, contented, having laughs every week. And in reality, they were a highly dysfunctional bunch. To the left, their son, Ricky Nelson, would become a successful singer-songwriter later in the 60s and 70s, and some of his material addressed family problems. The best-known example of these here in the St. Louis area was a show, Leave It to Beaver, and I have this down in the left-hand corner, which was not among the most popular at the time, but has lived on in syndication. And fitting into this would be the show I Love Lucy, which was of higher quality than any of these others in terms of acting, comedy, and scripts. And one of the things that's interesting about it is it had one of the few ethnic characters on television in this era, and that was Lucille Ball's real-life husband, Desi Arnaz, who was Cuban-American. So there's kind of this, this incomplete image that doesn't reflect reality presented through television, doesn't reflect the diversity of the country at all, nor does it reflect the fact that in the post-war period, Black Americans were making strides and becoming more visible in a lot of examples of popular culture. Sports. See here, Jackie Robinson, first Black professional baseball player in the major leagues who breaks the color line, playing with the Brooklyn Dodgers starting in 1947. He was followed by a whole group of fantastic Black players, most notably Henry Aaron and Willie Mays. And as I mentioned to the class, we could have a long argument over who was the more complete player in the 1950s, Henry Aaron, Willie Mays. Henry Aaron would end up having a much longer career than Willie Mays. Althea Gibson is important in this too, as one of the first Black professional tennis players for women. And in another form of popular culture, popular music, Black Americans were shaping the direction of post war music. They were instrumental in the development of a new musical form, rhythm and blues, which was becoming popular even in the last couple of years of World War II. It caught on with white teenagers in the post war period and becomes the basis for what becomes better known as rock and roll. Fats Domino, New Orleans pianist, Little Richard from Georgia, and St. Louis's own Chuck Berry, all key figures in this transition from rhythm and blues to early rock and roll. And white musicians like Bill Haley and Elvis Presley were going to start covering a number of these songs that black artists had done originally. And another part of the context for this is the Great Migration, historians have called it, which started in the early 20th century and continued through the 30s and even into World War II. Millions of Black Americans migrating from the South to northern cities, motivated in part to escape the racism of the South, although they were going to encounter different forms of systemic racism in northern cities, such as segregated housing, as we talked about in the presentation on suburbia. And it was motivated by access to better paying jobs, too. So Black families wanted the same sorts of things that Americans were talking about that I mentioned in the slide in suburbia. Home ownership, family life, quality education, quality schools for the kids. And this is why the post-war civil rights movement focuses, first of all, on segregated schools as an object to get changed. There are a number of court cases that are filed by Black families around the country that make their way through the court system, and eventually several of them are combined into the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka decision, historic decision 1954, where the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously rules that segregated public schools are unconstitutional. Then a critically important decision. It doesn't immediately change things. Some locations comply with it right away. There's massive resistance in various parts of the South for years. And one of the examples of white resistance with these groups, citizens' councils that sprung up under this motto, states' rights, racial integrity, which translated means, our right to continue these racist practices of segregated schools, with Black schools being underfunded, not supported with the same quality curriculum, access to quality textbooks. Find all sorts of examples of biology classes, for example, in Black schools where you don't even have access to a microscope. And these citizens' councils wanted to perpetuate that. And I pointed out to the class that they used as their symbol the American flag entwined with the Confederate battle flag. It's after World War II that the Confederate battle flag makes its appearance, and it's used as a symbol to perpetuate white power, racism, and segregation. So in the middle of all this happening, there's a teenage boy, 14 years old, Emmett Till, who lived in Chicago and is going to take a fateful trip to Mississippi in the summer of 1955. You see him here with his mother, Mamie Till. His father had been killed in World War II, and Emmett, who was a very fun-loving, outgoing, gregarious kid who loved to hear jokes, loved to tell jokes, is going to make a trip to Mississippi with cousins of his, and Mississippi was a foreign environment to Emmett Till. The Mississippi of 1955 was like what you would have seen throughout the South, with strictly enforced public segregation, and this was based on laws that existed in the South. Public facilities, like you see the sign here, colored waiting rooms, so bus stations, train stations, would have had segregated waiting rooms, segregated bathrooms. This was true of movie theaters. Buses were segregated, taxi cabs were segregated, restaurants were segregated, courtrooms segregated. Courtrooms even had separate Bibles for black and white witnesses. You see the example of the water fountain, with the nice new water fountain being whites only, the old crappy one being used for black residents. And there were strict customs and expectations for how blacks were supposed to interact with whites in the South in this time. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir. All of this was unfamiliar and potentially dangerous to somebody like Emmett Till, who attended an integrated school in Chicago. So I mentioned Emmett traveling with his cousins. He stays with their grandfather, Moses Wright, who was a sharecropper who lived in the countryside on property owned by a white landowner. He had a large swath of property in a rural area outside this little town, Money, Mississippi, which was a small, poor town in north central Mississippi. And I mentioned how there wasn't a lot to do: fishing, hunting, hanging out, telling jokes, trading stories. On weekends, the boys would go into Money, which, as I mentioned, was poor. You can see the dirt streets here. And a popular place to hang out was the only grocery store in town, Bryant's Grocery Store, which had this covered area here, this overhang in this screened-in porch that overhung the sidewalk at the front. So this was an area where you could get a break from the sun. There are these wooden benches. It was a popular spot for local kids to hang out. Emmett was interacting with local kids. The arrival of Emmett and his cousins was a big deal at the time. Money didn't get many visitors from Chicago. And Emmett was bragging to some of the local boys, calling girls he knew as girlfriends. He had pictures of girls who were classmates of his in his wallet, including white girls, saying, yeah, she's my girlfriend, she's my girlfriend. Typical kind of braggadocio for a 14-year-old boy. And one of the kids said, well, if you're such a big man, there's a white woman working in the store. I bet you won't go in and say hi to her. Emmett entered the store and bought either gum or candy, and that's where he has this fateful exchange with Carolyn Bryant, the 23-year-old wife of the store owner, who was working alone in the store at the time. What exactly happened between them remains a mystery. Bryant's account that she told under oath was a complete lie, fabrication, and exaggeration, which she admitted to in an interview with a historian a number of years ago. What I think is most likely, as I mentioned to the class, is that Emmett probably said something or whistled at her on his way out of the store. So some people who were there insist that what he did was say, bye, baby. Others have said, no, he did a kind of a wolf whistle. But whatever happened, a line had been crossed that, of course, was invisible to Emmett Till, and Carolyn Bryant ran to get a gun, and the boys quickly left and returned to Mose Wright's house. So Carolyn Bryant's husband, Roy Bryant, who also had a part-time job driving a truck, returns home, hears what happened, rounds up his half-brother, a guy named J.W. Milam. Both these guys were obnoxious. Neither of them were well-liked by anybody in the area. Milam was a physically large, bullying guy. And they decide that they're going to go to Mose Wright's house and abduct Emmett Till. And I'm going to stop at that point because I'm running out of time, and I'll pause this PowerPoint here and then finish up in the next installment.